A collective work is something where each individual item within the work can be copyrighted separately, but a single copyright covers the entire collective work, like a newspaper, a magazine, a readings book, several readings, or an anthology or whatever. That's a collective work. So obviously a newspaper, a magazine is a collective work, okay? Now, part of that, the law says that copyright in each separate contribution to a collective work is distinct from copyright in the collective work as a whole, and vests initially in the author of the contribution. That's certainly true. In other words, the original copyright. If I write an article that goes into an anthology, there's two copyrights there. My copyright for the work, for the individual work, and then the copyright for the anthology. That's a separate collective work. Okay. In the absence of an express transfer of the copyright or of any rights under it, the owner of copyright in the collective work is presumed to have acquired only the privilege of reproducing and distributing the contribution as part of that particular collective work. Any revision of that collective work and any later collective work in the same series. So all they can do is take that in a revision. And so the New York Times and so forth, they argued that taking this and putting it into a CD or putting it in a database was merely a revision of the collective work. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected that and said, no, it is not a revision, because when you, in a database, when you publish a story in the New York Times, and you look at the New York Times, it's within the text, in the context of all this other stuff. When you access it in a database, all you get is the article. So it is not a revision. The court said is not a revision of the collective work, and therefore you have to have a right. If you want to put it in this database, you have to have the right to do that. So nowadays, that's simply what happens, is that freelancer, when you do this, you will be asked to sign over the right. I know I did an article for the Illinois Bar Journal a few years ago, and I signed over the rights to it, but then later I got a thing from LexisNexis saying, we want to publish this in LexisNexis, is it okay? And I said yes, and that's the end of it. But now, so in other words, you have to have a separate agreement for every type of medium there. That's not that sort of thing would not be the original copyright doesn't apply to that. So that Ticini case, from freelancer standpoint, is a very, very important case, and certainly narrows the rights that a publisher has when they get the rights to publish an article or whatever. You have to have separate agreements for databases, CD-ROMs, or anything else you might do later. Okay. Okay, real quickly, as I said, we apparently can't get to it, but they're the agreement on guidelines for classroom copying and not-for-profit educational institutions with respect to books and periodicals. So you can, as you can see down here, you can see the went too far. See an article in a newspaper, a graphic, short story, brevity, a pody. So this is what 250 words, 10% of 1,000 words. That's where all those percentages come from. Okay. Now, these agreements were later. Congress did in fact say that the agreements for this agreement, the educational guidelines for music, that these two guidelines were in fact sort of recognized by Congress as sort of the minimum of what fair use is. So it does have some force of law in that regard, but it's not, it's not statutory in any strict imagination. Now the guidelines for recording of broadcast programming came later and doesn't have that same. But once again, they do the same thing. You know, if you do it for 10 consecutive days, 45 days, and they do, you know, there's all sorts of things like that. And so that's where those guidelines come from. And then there are guidelines for library and classroom use of copyrighted videotapes and computer software that some groups came up with. The American Library Association has a model policy on classroom use of copyrighted videotapes and computer software. With 1986, as if, you know, software hadn't changed at all since 1986. And there's a guide to the ethical and legal use of software for members of the academic community that was in January that people came up with. And everybody's always trying to come up with guidelines. I note there in 1994, the Conference on Fair Use was established, and they spent like 4 years trying to come up with all sorts of guidelines, and basically they ended up saying, we can't do it. The whole thing went on for about 5 years. In fact, you can go to I've got that on the website there. You can go to use motion pictures and audio visual works and so forth in a classroom setting, okay, without, and that's basically not a violation of copyright. Now, but it was cast in terms of a physical classroom, okay. Well, in the Technology, Education, and Copyright Harmonization Act of 2002, the TEACH Act, extends the protections of Section 110 to online, the virtual classroom. Okay. Now, basically, we put you to sleep going through that entire statute here. But basically, what the statute does is, in other words, you know, under 110, as long as I note there, the activities are not a copyright infringement of Section 110. In the case of motion pictures and audio-visual works, the copy being used must be a legal copy. That's very important. In other words, the statute makes that very clear, both for traditional classrooms and digital class. Online classrooms, that anything you use, the digital copies of the use, must be legal copies. So if you illegally let's say you rent a movie and you paid $40 to rent it, and then you say, well, let's get that digitized and let's make a copy of it, then we can use it forever. Well, that is not a legal copy. So if you then use that in a classroom, you're violating copyright law because you are using a copy which is not legal. That's very important. It has to be a legal copy. Okay, you should have known, or you didn't know that it was not a legal copy and so forth. It also is interesting that the TEACH Act only applies to non-profit educational institutions. It does not apply to for-profit. So it doesn't apply to Phoenix or any of the other for-profit institutions, which is sort of interesting. Now notice what it basically does is that that you can take analog works that you have, that you've purchased, often have to be legal copies or whatever, you've purchased these, and then you can digitize them. Although the law does say that if a digital version is available, you really have to buy it. Okay? So it depends on, situation. So if we have 5,000 slides of the great art of the 16th century that the art department uses all the time, if there's a digital version of those available, you couldn't just have cats digitize all those and use them if you can purchase a digital copy of those. Okay, so that's the big. And also there's an exception here for if something is marketed specifically for online delivery of things, then this doesn't apply either. And there's more and more of that. So you take a course that has been marketed, and then you just take it and use it. That obviously that's not applicable either. Section 110 doesn't apply in those situations either.